Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today I want to talk about organic pest control, really without spraying, and talking a little bit about how to control pests in the garden without using pesticides, because unfortunately pests happen in the garden. I'm afraid it is part of the natural balance of the world that is your garden. And really, as stewards of the land, we're here to help bring balance to the garden. And I like to use a more integrated pest management style of gardening that I learned during my permaculture design course. And I really like to let the natural predators do the work. It's not necessarily because I'm a super lazy gardener, but I'm a very busy gardener. But oftentimes what I find is that my garden over the last few years has just gotten better and better and better, and has been more alive with beneficial insects that are coming from all over, not probably just my local neighborhood, but maybe even the neighborhood beyond, because there's just so many things that are there for beneficial insects to be part of. I really love every year when I've gone out and I've found praying mantises. That's not something that I had really seen. Certainly in the UK, we don't have them, but being able to see them up close and personal and just, watch them as they are tackling the pests and doing their thing is really quite fascinating. And although I'm incredibly squeamish when it comes to certain types of bugs, particularly spiders, it's really fascinating to watch them in the garden as a whole. And my husband always thinks it's really funny that if I see a spider in the house, I am jumping as high as possible, well away from it, screaming bloody murder about this spider, and all the dogs are jumping around me at the time. But in the garden, I'm just able to kind of breeze past them and work with them that are in there. So using these more integrated pest management styles of gardening can take time, and sometimes I really want the cabbages not to be half chewed by snails. If you are on the Facebook group, then you will have seen the picture of the cabbage that has been decimated by a snail, but also I get it, right? I don't want squash bugs to be invading all of my winter squashes, and those dang Mormon crickets that appear every year. I don't want them to have eaten my first ripe tomato, and they did this year. They got to it before I did. So I get it when you say that you want to control the pests in your garden, but for a sustainable organic garden, we need to be looking from the viewpoint, rather than looking at it from the viewpoint of kill all the pests, we need to change your mindset and start looking at it to what are these pests telling me about my garden? So let's talk a little bit about what that story is, because pests typically attack weaker or stressed out plants. Just as, if you've ever watched, a nature show on TV, the predators are typically picking off, the weaker animal in the herd, and pests are doing the same. They're often an indicator that something is going wrong in the garden. And one of the common reasons for things going wrong is often the soil. And the soil is, typically the main reason behind weaker plants. Plants that have a healthy soil and adequate fertility around their roots tend to have a better immunity system and are able to resist plants and diseases. So by fixing the soil, by using organic gardening methods, like mulching and applying compost, those kind of things, they're going to help your garden each season. And by applying compost throughout the growing season, we can really help to maintain the fertility levels in your soil. And remember, we want to be adding 2 to 3 inches of compost in fall or early spring to your garden to help it grow. And if you have terrible luck with gardening so far, and you're kind of feeling like, I can't grow a garden, I don't have a green thumb. By the way, I don't believe that anybody has a green thumb. Everybody can grow a garden. garden, but maybe take a little bit of time and go through the intensive gardening training series that we have on the podcast to really dig in and learn a little bit more, because it's not too late to start prepping your garden beds, and it's never too late to start converting to an intensive garden and using more of these more natural gardening techniques, which is ultimately better for you as well as the garden, right? So let's talk a little bit about pesticides, because on the whole, pesticides are bad news. And the use of pesticides, even organic ones, can do more harm than good in your garden. Like even those organic pesticides that you make yourself, like the natural sprays and things, or you buy an unlisted commercial organic pesticide, they can still hurt the beneficial insects like pollinators in your garden, as well as the bad bugs that you're trying to control. And pests that survive the use of those pesticides are going to be stronger and are going to do even more damage in the garden. So that's why in an intensive organic garden, pesticides, even those natural ones, are a last resort. So let's change it up and talk about changing your mindset, because I'm sure most of you listening have walked through a grocery store and a grocery store's produce section. If you haven't, then definitely next time you're in there, go check it out. Because it's actually kind of hard to see that pests exist when you look in a grocery store in the produce. We do a lot of removing and picking to ensure that there are no nibble marks on the produce for sale. Consumers, so that's you and me when we're going to the store, we don't want to see that there's a hole missing in the middle of the spinach leaf from a bug. We don't want to see chew marks on things. We want perfect produce that is uniform, right? We've been kind of conditioned that that is what is normal. But when you look in a garden, quite the opposite is true, right? In our garden, though, we cultivate, we can cultivate healthy soil, we can cultivate healthy plants, and we can bring balance to the bad bugs if we can forgive the nibbles, right? And allow a higher tolerance for insect damage. I've walked around so many different gardens, right? And I've walked around them all across the US. Like, I love visiting botanical gardens. That was always really fun when I traveled for work, but also, different places within the UK and Europe too. I've seen so many gardens, and all of them have insect damage on their plants, right? Insect damage is inevitable, but as a consumer, the world of growing food is quite far removed from the reality, and we've very overly sanitized like what it is that produce should look like, right? It should be all uniform, right? It should be free from imperfections. It shouldn't have, nibble marks and stuff like that on it from pests. But really, when you are looking at how, our great grandparents or our grandparents or even our parents, right, in some cases, grew food, that wasn't the case in a garden. There is so much more diversity. There is difference in shapes and sizes and colors and textures, because that's how, plants are breeding and are transferring those genes along, right? That's kind of evolution there. And being able to accept a higher level of insect damage on our gardens can actually kind of help to bring us closer to the garden as a whole, but also see the successes that we have in our garden rather than just the failures, right? I can't tell you the number of times I've gone to get what looks like a perfectly juicy tomato only to find that a cricket has chewed half of it off on the other side. That's really frustrating. But then, I have to remember, well, I maybe left that a little bit too long on the vine, and that cricket was like, hey, this is a delightful all-you-can-eat buffet, and this is delicious. But also growing different varieties vegetables have different tolerances for pests as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. But let's talk about successional sowing, right? Because as you are moving towards an organic garden, it is going to take time for those beneficial insects to find your little organic oasis, right? I mentioned earlier, it took me a good couple of years before I started getting more and more beneficial insects, and really the last 2 years have been where my garden is just alive. Like, I can go out there any day of the week and it is just humming with bees and native wasps and ladybugs and praying mantises. Like, there is just so much that's there going on, but it didn't happen like that overnight. It took a good couple of years of, planting a variety of plants, having flowers, having things that are going to bring in these beneficial insects, having a place for them to overwinter, right? I don't chop down everything in the garden. I leave some areas a little bit wild to have a haven for some of these predatory insects. But as such, when you are starting to move to an organic garden, you are going to need to accept more damage to your plants than you would like. And one tip that I have to overcome this level of damage is to successionally sow. So that is to succession plant, so you can look forward to having a harvest if your first sowing doesn't go well. And this is a technique I use in my garden over and over again, especially if I have a scant number of seeds for a rare variety that I've traded in a seed swap, right? So often, if you guys have been part of a seed swap, you don't get loads of seeds as part of that. Maybe you'll get like a lot of different varieties, but maybe you'll only get between 5 and 15 seeds for each plant variety that you're getting, because people are often swapping with lots of different people and you don't want to completely obliterate the supply that you have. By the way, if you are interested in a seed swap, there is a thread in the Facebook group, so definitely join if you are interested in having a seed swap. There's a lot of gardeners that are interested. There's a lot of gardeners that are saving their own seeds, so there's a lot of opportunity there. But let's go through an example of a succession sowing, right? So let's say, I've got a rare variety in a seed swap. What I'll do is I will sow a variety of the same plant. So let's say beans, because I freaking love beans and I have lots of different bean seeds. So let's say that I have lots of one variety of seed. Let's say it's Belotti beans, because I grow those most years and I've saved them from a long time from when I was in the UK. So let's say that I've got some Belotti beans that I've saved for a few years, and I did a seed swap and I got 5 soldier bean seeds. And what I would do for this successional sowing is I would plant those Belotti seeds first, because I've got more of them. So let's say I plant out a row of Belotti seeds. The pests might come and munch away at those plants and destroy them. And then I would sow my soldier bean seeds that I traded. I would sow those a couple of weeks later, after the initial pest pressure has passed. Now, with any luck, those soldier bean seeds would be able to grow without being decimated by the pests which destroyed the first harvest. And this is a really good strategy for those of you that are troubled by squash bugs, for example. You could do a sowing in early spring and then one again in late summer, so that you can still get a good harvest even with the insect damage, but you've got more than one opportunity there for plants to be growing and for you to be harvesting. I will say that I really miss not having my chickens, because they were really great at eating things that were overly damaged, like produce that was coming from the garden that had like lots of nibble holes, as well as like eating some of the bugs that were causing the damage, right? They didn't mind one bit leafy greens that had flea beetle damage on them, the tomatoes that were obliterated by the crickets. They liked it even better if the cricket came with the tomato, but plants that were like very heavily damaged that I'd pulled up and threw in with the chickens. Like they would eat all those bugs. They got the extra protein. They ate the plants. It was like this beautiful cycle that was going on. And I do really miss not having my chickens. But as we're planning on moving, yep. Definitely new things that are happening over here. We don't have chickens at the moment, so hopefully in the next couple of months we will be settled and we will have chickens again. But chickens were really great at helping maintain pest control. But moving towards kind of a holistic pest management, like these integrated pest management techniques, they take time and you will need to persevere. And you need to keep remembering that success of your garden really is inevitable. And the methods that you will find that work best in your garden may be different from another gardener and their garden. And don't be discouraged if you have a failure and all that you're seeing is successes on Instagram or on Facebook. Gardeners with a lot of experience and gardeners that are really observing the land that they are working with, they're learning these techniques and they're applying them. And that's part of the beauty of having a garden, is experimenting and finding what is working for you. And once you hone in on those skills, your garden just thrives. And sometimes, it's getting to know something different. Like when we move, if we're moving to Texas, let's say, because that's where I've got family, if we move there, like I'm going to have to change how I garden because I've never grown in such high humidity. Even when I lived on the East Coast up in New Jersey, like the humidity and the heat are very different from what I would be dealing with in the South. And also planting times are going to be different depending on where you are. So getting an understanding of the area that you're in and what grows best when is really going to help you with your gardening journey and being able to tackle these pests. Like getting an understanding from the extension office, like, hey, what pests are prevalent in these areas and where do we see the most damage. You can start to figure out what it is that you need to plant and when, which brings me on to one of the things that we can do to control in our garden is timing, right? When seeds are started, that is something we can absolutely control. And you might find it helpful actually to start plants earlier by starting seeds indoors and doing it under grow lights and then transplanting them out under frost protection in very early spring to get a longer harvest before the pest numbers, also known as the pest pressure, gets too much and becomes a problem. And you can do the same for the back end of the season and have a really great full garden by starting seeds inside and then transplanting out the bigger plants, because your pest pressure tends to be highest in the mid-summer for most places. It might be different for other areas, but midsummer tends to be about the right time where you have a lot of pests in the garden. The next thing we want to do is to really choose wisely, right? And by that I'm meaning the variety of plants that we choose to grow are going to make a big difference in our garden. I'm a really big fan of the garden journal to record observations that we have in the garden. You might find that there's certain varieties that are more susceptible to pests than others, and by recording these notes and experimenting in your garden, that's one of the keys to growing a successful garden. And you're going to be able to hone in on those varieties which grow best in your garden, and that means that the plants that are growing are going to thrive. So for example, let's go back to the beans. I know that my Berlotti beans thrive really well in the garden, as do some Romano 2, which is a climbing pole bean. Those beans are amazing, and those have very few pest problems where I am here in Utah. But when I move, I get to experiment all of these varieties again and find out what is going to grow best in different climates, right? If we end up on the East Coast, varieties that grow best there are going to be very different from those that are in Georgia, for example, or Florida, right? So hone in on varieties that grow best in your garden and make notes of those observations, right? If you see a lot of tomato hornworms on a particular variety, then maybe not grow that variety, right? Look at the variety that was growing that had fewer incidences of tomato hornworm on there, and maybe try a different variety and see if it has more or less. And make sure to record those notes so you don't forget, and use those to help drive your decisions in the varieties that you are going to grow as you go through those exercises each year of, what am I going to plant this year in my garden? What variety am I going to experiment with this year, right? It's a cool experiment to be able to do. And I mean, if you're really looking to be providing a reliable resource of food for your family, then really knowing the plants that are growing and growing well and growing with fewer diseases, it must be part of that evaluation that you're doing on the plants that you are going to be growing. Let's talk a little bit about companion planting. And I know we've talked a little bit about this already on the podcast, but planting your veggies in close proximity of flowers, herbs, and other vegetables really can help to confuse pests with the art of camouflage. Masking, a pest's favourite snack food with other plants around them is really how companion planting's working from a pest control perspective. The different leaf shapes, flowers and scents, they all serve to camouflage your plants better than a marine on manoeuvres. You really want to experiment though with different combinations to find what is successful in your garden. For example, right now I've got chickpeas, popcorn and blackberries all growing very happily together, which was part accident and part intentional. The accidental part was the blackberries appearing, but the chickpeas and the popcorn were an intentional combination together. But they're growing very happily, very healthily, and I would never have known about that combination if I hadn't have experimented and I hadn't taken notes. So take a look. Ask your friends that are gardeners, ask, other people that are growing around you, and see what is growing good in their garden and use that as a basis to start your garden, or try a combination of your own, or listen to the companion planting podcast episode for some ideas of what you can try in your garden. Okay, the next thing when it comes to pest control without pesticides is that you really need to be like Elsa. And when you're gardening and you're not using pesticides, you really need to learn to let it go. It is often a better strategy to remove infested leaves by chopping them off if you spot the problem early. And, if you've got pill bugs, for example, all over a summer squash plant that is now looking a gross kind of mottled yellow colour, it is probably better to cut the plant off at the base, level with the soil and remove it from the garden, and then go back and add compost and mulch to cover the bare soil, or use a cover crop, right? We get very attached to the plants in our garden, and we often see it as a failure if that plant is not working. But realistically, what happens is when we're growing, not everything is going to grow well, and some things will succumb to pests, and it's okay if we just kind of decide to pull it up and get rid of it and start again. It's okay that happens. You are not a failure as a gardener, and look at what else is growing better in the garden and learn. Try to kind of figure out what is making that grow better. Is it the type of plant that is growing better there? Is it a variety? Is it the location? Is it getting more water than some of the others? Is it getting less water? Is it somewhere that's getting more sun or less sun? Like, what are some of those things that are maybe causing that bed or that plant to have some of those issues? And if we can figure out what may be the cause, we can start to try things to help remedy those problems, and then that will help our garden grow. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is to practice good hygiene when it comes to your garden. So I tend to collect diseased plant materials in a bucket that only go to the garbage, right? And then other things from the garden that are destined for the chickens or the compost, I put those in a tub truck, right? It's like a big flexible tote kind of thing. And because they're two different containers, right? One's a white bucket, one is a green tub truck, right? I've got that separation of those containers to stop mix up of diseased materials going into the compost heap, which is possibly going to spread those diseases around the garden, and that's not something that we want to do. We want to keep things separate, because if we're going to introduce disease by composting and stuff, that's going to help make these problems worse, and we're going to attract more pests into the garden. So keep things separate. If you've got diseased materials, get them out of the garden, put them in the garbage. Don't put them in the composter where they can spread in the garden next year. Anyway, I hope you found this episode helpful. Please let me know in the Facebook group what it is that you are trying in your garden to tackle the pests with, and show me pictures of what's growing well in your garden. I love to see how your garden grows. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I'll see you all next week.